I'm not quite sure where the boundary is between a storied career and just couldn't hold a job, but it's great to be here, and I had no clue that I was going to be following someone who would be talking to you about headless stacks, which is an amazing segue, because it was going on 10 years ago that Mark Benioff looked at me across the breakfast table and said, in the process of making our application as customizable as the users demand, as integratable as the legacy IT environment requires, we've discovered that we've refactored the code to the point that the CRM layer on top could be removed. And what's under it would be as general purpose a platform as something like Windows is. And he asked me not a technical question, but almost an anthropological question. Would developers ever take seriously the idea of building an application that's their intellectual property, their distinctive process, but runs in an environment that they don't own, that they don't touch, that they don't directly control, and have the resulting application provisioned back to themselves and their customers as a service? And he was just asking me, going on 10 years ago, you think that could work? Would developers buy that idea? Well, as you've heard, 6 years ago, about 4 years later, I got the call from him again saying, okay, our customers are just trying to demand that we behave like a platform. They're squeezing that functionality out of what we've got. We need to fill in the gaps and discover what it means to be a platform. And of course, today, TechCrunch just put out a headline saying, Salesforce.com is a platform company, period. Okay, that might be a little oversimplified, but it sure is a different way of thinking about what we are than we were having 10 years ago. And I really want to talk today about getting over some of the things that we've obsessed about over the last few years, which are really now pretty much done deals. They're enablers, they're in place. And the opportunity to add value now is very much in what you can create on top of that. We're a publicly traded company. Please don't ever do business with us based on what we might do for you someday. The rest of this is on the Investor Relations website. I have a shorter form version of this, which is everything you're going to see today is real. This cloud thing, adjectives disappear. Saying digital camera sounds kind of quaint. Saying cell phone sounds kind of quaint. And saying cloud computing is beginning to sound kind of quaint. What's the other kind? The thing you do when the internet is down? I'm not sure what that is anymore. And even if you look at Google Trends, you'll discover that digital camera is still news to somebody every December when they go shopping for their first one as a gift. But this phrase cloud computing hit peak interest going on 2.5 years ago. People are just asking fewer questions about it. Using the label cloud computing is like saying, my gosh, you have indoor plumbing? I mean, it suggests you come from a somewhat primitive environment in which this is still a novelty. The point is not the cloud. The point is, what are you doing on the cloud? Cloud's a medium of connection. And the funny thing is, if we had not used the word cloud in the first place, I think we'd have had a lot less trouble getting the whole idea bought. Cloud is a verb with no positive meanings whatsoever. To cloud something is never to improve it. It is to confuse it, is to obfuscate it. If we had said, no, we're going to call this connected computing. Connection is an affirmative good. And cloud should be viewed more as a medium of connection than as a destination for migrating your IT capability. That's not interesting at all. The connective tissue that this represents is what creates value opportunities. For example, look at GM OnStar. Most people think of OnStar as the blue button on the rearview mirror. You push it and you talk to an operator. Almost half the traffic now on OnStar is machine originated. If you're driving a Volt or one of the new Cadillac ELRs on the Volt platform that'll be out later this year, yes, they can tell if your airbag has deployed. That's not probably something that's going to happen to you a lot during the time you're driving that car, but they can tell you things like your gas cap's open. These things are wired. They are censored and algorithmed to death. There are dozens of processors on board, and they really now are mobile network nodes that happen to include an automobile function. This also works at the industrial level. General Electric is doing these brilliant machines ads that you've seen on TV. They're doing the obvious ones like locomotives, but if you're running a field of wind turbines and you run them as individual machines, you're going to make trade-offs on wind speed, de-icing behavior, and so on. GE is managing the entire field as one organism through an API, and the result is a significant output increase of 3%. That may not sound like a lot. It's $1 million on a field of 123 turbines. And Jeff Immelt at GE likes to talk about what he calls 1% problems. If you're in an industry with a core profitability of 5%, and you can cut a core cost by 1% or increase a revenue stream by 1%, that's a 20% improvement at the bottom line. It's vital to look at the leverage that an API can represent for you, when it allows you to start managing things as a whole, managing things as a system, instead of just managing a large number of them as individual independent devices. And then finally, not merely making things better, but creating things that are qualitatively different. What does ASICS sell? ASICS sells running shoes. What do people buy running shoes to do? They buy running shoes to run. What does a marathon runner do? They run 26.2 miles. ASICS put RFID tags in the shoelace tag on the shoe and arranged that when runners ran past a certain point in the marathon course, the RFID tag would be detected, and a personalized video greeting from family or friends might appear on the Jumbotron where they could see it at that point in the race. And people said, my gosh, this completely transformed the experience of running in a marathon. It wasn't just me out there alone against the clock. It was me with all my friends and family. And they posted tweets saying, my gosh, ASICS, best marathon ever. This is not a better running shoe. This is a running shoe with an API that says, why do people run? People run for health, they run for self-esteem, they run for companionship and fellowship, they run for lots of reasons. Get to the root reason that people want your product, and instead of making the product better, serve that need. Go through the conduit of your product and say, how can I deliver more delight in the reason that you bought the product, in the experience that you hoped to have by owning it? Now, if people connect to you, that implies interest, and it's rude to ignore people's interests. This word social gets used a lot by people in kind of a sneering way of, oh, well, social, that's recreational, that's non-professional. No, I'm sorry. Here's the thought experiment for getting that mindset off the table. What is the opposite of social? Antisocial. There is no positive association for the label antisocial. To be antisocial is to not care about someone's context, to not care about their motivations, not have any memory of any past interactions you've had with them. To build social systems is not to build systems pre-equipped with cat videos. To build social systems is to build systems that maintain a history of their interaction with you, that use intelligent algorithms to suggest and discover things that might be valuable to you in the way that, for example, people like Amazon use the match engine to say, well, other people like this. Netflix, of course, is famous for their open sourcing of an algorithm competition to predict what movies you'll like. We make social connections to seek or to offer value, not just for the fun of it. And today, the cost of finding and making connections is getting smaller. The cost of preserving them is significant. And so what we have to be asking ourselves all the time is, how do we make ourselves an attractive social partner to our customer, to our supply chain, to our competitors? How do we wind up being the competitor that everyone wants to be on good terms with? How do we do that? And APIs are an extraordinarily important means of making yourself the heart of the conversation in whatever the conversation is that you want to, as they say, own, if you want to own the dinner party. Now, if you're going to have a connection, it does invite a conversation. Beth Comstock did a video with us. She's the CMO at GE. She said, okay, well, having a jet engine that can talk to you is kind of cool, but what would it say? Kind of an important question. I remember Dave Methvin back at Ziff Davis used to say, well, if you had an Ethernet-compatible washing machine and dryer, what would they talk about on the network? What would they do? Well, you saw some of it at the Consumer Electronics Show. If you walked around the floor, you saw more and more things that had an API that would let you, monitor the state of your washer load on your iPhone, which if you're a college student is kind of cool. Or if you're using a laundromat, kind of cool. But that's remote controlling the product. That's a product-to-product connection. There are more opportunities than that. There's product to company. There's customer to customer. So be asking yourself, what are the questions that it would be really, really interesting to enable? They may not be questions that anyone's thought to ask yet. You may really, really need to explode the box around what you think you do. Because the context of conversations is changing. We know what applications do. You buy a computer, you look around the business and say, okay, it's everything that people are doing with pencil and paper. Let's write Fortran code, COBOL code that does that. Let's write a spreadsheet that does that. Let's automate the business process. And data records the byproducts of business process. And this is what computers have been used for a really long time. And if you think that APIs merely give you ways of, poking holes into that monolith and asking questions from it and getting answers from it, you might have a technical success, but you're going to be missing some really important opportunities. What do apps do today? Apps are not applications. Old applications automated the business activities, captured the byproducts of those activities. They had very little attention paid to user experience because, after all, they were provided to a captive audience. And they were judged on metrics of how efficiently did they use the computer. How fast were they? How much little memory could they use? That's what applications were. Apps today are different. This is an app from a company called Seatow, S-E-A-T-O-W, like tow truck, only for your boat. Most people don't need one real often. When they need one, they need it real bad. What they've done is put out a free app that does all sorts of cool things. It's a GPS, it's a speedometer, it has weather and tide forecasting. It's an act of what I like to call preciprocation. They offer you value before you're doing business with them. They don't wait for you to do business with them before they throw you a thank you for being our customer goodie. They throw out the goodie in advance. And on the day when your boat is not boating, but merely floating, there's that. Slide for assistance. They've been literally in your hand, in your face, during all those good times you've been having with your boat, and in the moment when you need a tow, there it is. Are you really going to bother getting on the radio and asking someone who you should call? You know who you're going to call. These guys have been in your hand every time you've been out in your boat for the last year or two. That's what apps do today, and that's what APIs need to be enabling you to do. To say, my gosh, how do I go beyond automating and nouning and verbing the interactions I have with my customers now? How do I become the most interesting conversationalist in the space where my customers live so that they want to know me, so that they want to do things with me that are cheap for me to do, but have high perceived value for them? Total win-win scenario. Now, as for data, someone at a conference that MIT hosted in San Francisco a while ago said, the cardinal sin is to think that big data means bigger database, because the semantics of databases have been subtractive. For almost as long as there have been such things as databases, what do queries do? They throw away the things that you aren't interested in and show you the things that are left. That's what they do. They throw stuff away. They only answer the questions that you ask. Big data has to be about a fundamentally new approach of inviting the data to tell you things that you didn't think to ask about. And this is not really that new an idea, because somewhere around 30 years ago, a neural net that was being operated by American Express for Shell Oil's credit card operation spontaneously surfaced the insight that late-night purchases of $1 worth of gas frequently were an early warning of a stolen credit card. What was the pay at the pump when it was first introduced? It was a way of finding out if a credit card was still working without having to look at a human being across the counter so that your face would not be remembered. The crooks figured this out very quickly. It took a neural net to tell American Express. That was fundamentally an act of spontaneous discovery in the data, not something that someone went out and asked the data about. The only difference today? Boy, do we have a whole lot more data sources. We've got a population that's busily equipped itself with portable detectors for position, motion, emotional state, whatever. We know a lot about people. We know a lot about their devices. We have so much more quantity of stuff. That's what makes it big. But we need to be applying an orientation of discovery rather than query. We need to be saying to the data, what do you know that I would want to know? And that's why data science is a very fast-growing discipline. It is not the same thing as database administration. It's a tremendously interesting field. And if you want to know, how do I know that I'm not just doing a bigger database? New data is what the world is doing right now, not what the business did yesterday. New apps are what would delight the customer, not what are we doing around here as just part of staying in business. And if your API can't describe these things, you can't do them. If you haven't constructed APIs with nouns and verbs of engagement and delight, it's going to be really hard for you to be much fun at the party. Now, how long have we been having this conversation? Well, Rosenshine and Zlotkin over at MIT wrote a book quite some time ago called Rules of Encounter. They were talking not about APIs specifically. They were talking about autonomous agents, intelligent agents that roam around and that doing things for us. But I find that some of their key points map directly onto the construction of what I'll call a non-naive API. It's really trivial to build an API that, as someone once said of the typical graduate student project, handles the test case perfectly. Congratulate yourself, implement, and move on. Okay, I want you to imagine a poker API that can't understand the concept of bluffing. Can't do it, can't test for it. Might be able to do an interesting demo of two equally naive agents playing against each other, but the minute there's a person in the game, the agent's going to go down in flames. In a less fanciful way, one of the examples that Rosenshine and Zlotkin used was, imagine we've got an API that allows an airport to prioritize landing of aircraft based on where they are, how fast they're going, and how much fuel they're carrying. How long would it take some clever programmer to figure out that if he systematically underreports the fuel on board by 5%, over the course of a year, he'll get just that little bit of extra edge in how quickly they try to get him on the ground? That could amount to an enormous amount of money if you know anything about how much fuel gets burned during that last slow descent phase of an airline. You need to build APIs that go beyond the, yeah, we can make it work, to the, how robust will this be in an environment where people are always looking for an edge? Suppose you've got an API for automatic reordering of things from a supplier. How long would it be before a supplier builds an API that just every now and then does a little test? If we increase the price by 3%, does this customer reduce his ordering? This isn't hard to do. This is simple to do algorithmically. No human hands involved. If you build naive APIs, you are the mark at the table. So try to think about the next step of build APIs that can have an adult conversation and not just do a great demonstration. Another, what might seem very semantic kind of point is to ask, which is the API, the noun or the verb? It's really easy if you write an application and say, great, now let's add an API to it. It's really easy to wind up having the noun with verbs wrapped around it as the API. This is exactly the wrong way to do it. Because people don't do nouns, people do verbs. If the verb is the center of the API, print this document, upload this file, whatever. If the verb, the action that people want to perform, is kept as what we call the high order bit of the API, it relentlessly focuses your attention on maximizing the user experience, minimizing the degree to which your API calcifies what you've always done, and instead make it a language in which it's easy to suggest innovation. Verbs are open-ended. People always want to do things better. But if you wrap the API around the nouns of your system, you're kind of tying its hands from day one. Someone once said the problem with object-oriented programming is that if you teach a conventional programmer an object-oriented language, he'll take his program, look for object classes, break up the program into objects, and declare victory. It will be modular, but like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, the modules will only fit together in a way that makes one useful thing. And he'll say, how come I'm not getting the reuse that I was promised? Again, this tends to come from noun-centric thinking about what your API is doing. Why would anyone else find your API useful for anything else if you weren't thinking all the time about what would they like to know? Here's what can happen. What interaction should a customer object enable? Or, for example, what interaction should a warehouse object enable? Here is an actual case, I won't name the city, that had an API for its warehouses. No one gave the warehouses a way of losing stuff, which oddly enough does happen. Things get lost, things get stolen, things get discarded because they've gone bad in storage, whatever. Well, the users were smart. They had to account for the imbalance. They did have an API that allowed them to create a new warehouse, Warehouse 13. And if they couldn't figure out what had happened to something, it got sent to Warehouse 13. Warehouse 13 wound up with a very impressive inventory for a place that didn't exist. Users are smart. Try to build APIs that let them do the right thing instead of APIs that only allow them the wrong thing as an option. And finally, are you speaking a language of value? It's very easy to devise an API that is the vocabulary of what your application does. It is harder to step outside the application and say, well, wait a minute, what are people trying to do when they're using this application? So for example, you might have an API that says print file. Well, that's what the application does, so I'm going to have an API for that. Okay, interesting, boring. Okay, not interesting at all, really. Fit documentation on page. Okay, now that's starting to be a little bit more like what the user might ask you to do. It's not an obvious function, but when you think about it, a lot of the time people are doing little edits to documents and trying to make it fit on one page so they don't have to have 3 lines on the next page. That's kind of a cool API. That's starting to add value to the application. That's starting to turn it into a partner instead of just a passive tool. That's kind of cool. But then the next step would be to say, well, wait a minute. What about stretching the envelope? People today use documents not with the goal of putting some black marks on some dead tree. They use documents as part of a communication task or a business transaction task. They're sending a contract, whatever. What about an API for summarize document content and share with routing list? Okay, you might not have one single API that big and hairy. That starts to sound like a 5 megabyte WSDL. That starts to sound like an object method that spans more than one screen of code, not a good thing. But what it does is get you thinking about what are things that we'd like to be able to ask this thing to do. Not how do we develop a vocabulary that describes what it does now, but how do we create a language of adding value around what we already have that really makes it exciting, that makes it something people want to build on in unexpected ways. Because everything you heard this morning was about that. You're not just putting out a bag of Lego bricks and a manual of things you can build with it. You're putting out something that's a lot more exciting than that, or should be. So I've already stressed this. It's easy to devise an API that exposes the functions of your product. It is bolder to invite interaction with your customers. What's the next step? The next step is to create an API that makes you the heart of an ecosystem. By all means, lead. But you're going to have to lead in what some people might call the Grateful Dead way, where at the Grateful Dead, they invite people to come to the concerts, record them, share the bootleg recordings. What does it do? It creates interest for the brand. It creates a desire to come to the live performance and see the real thing. Now, you heard interesting tension on stage today. Panels are only good when there's at least one disagreement. You heard one person say, well, no, we don't expose all the functions of our application through the API. And you heard someone else say, oh, we do that. And every now and then, someone does take advantage of that. Someone does abuse that once in a while. You got to roll with it. You got to roll with it. Every now and then, you're going to have a party guest who has a little bit too good of a time. We know people who try to run their parties in such a way that that can't happen. They're not very good parties. You're trying to host a good party here. You don't get to be the circus ringmaster anymore. You certainly don't get to be the drill sergeant. The new model is you're host of the party. And you want to be the party that everybody would like to attend. And it is leadership to devise an API that becomes the language of an ecosystem. This chart is the only one that I stuck in this morning. I feel so sorry for people who are trying to put together conferences and they ask you if they could just please have the charts 2 weeks in advance. I said, do you know how long that is in internet years? It's a long time. This is brand new data this morning. We had another record month for our API activity, 31.5 billion transactions, and these are not get set transactions. These are like, give me a record. These are real business transactions. Up 50% from a year ago. I mean, the growth is just vast. I'm not particularly comfortable with people saying, well, we're a platform company, period, because the fact is we still have a lot of people working on CRM. But the enablement that the platform provides, not just to us, but to our customers. I believe that 95% of our customers would not self-identify as platform users. You would have to ask them questions like, well, have you ever written a trigger? Have you ever done an integration? Have you ever created a new custom object? Have you ever added something in an edge or a corner case of the system? And they'll say, oh, yeah, we do that all the time. Congratulations, you've been speaking prose all your life. You are a platform user. People who are creating and not just consuming are, in some way, finding a way to get a platform out of you. And the more you understand about what they are demanding you do, the more you can support them with tools, documentation, meetups, communities, the kind of job that I get paid to be on planes for, about 50 weeks a year. And finally, the last point I want to make here is that like some other people that you've heard from today, like Amazon, like Elastic Path, we have a new definition of when something's done. You begin by writing the API, and after the API works, you're allowed to put UI on top. That is our commitment, and you're going to see some really amazing stuff in November at Dreamforce as a result of the first significant period in which we've really been developing to that as an internal mantra. We are putting a lot of skin in the game on the idea that the API really is the creative medium that you are making available to your customers, and that continually thinking about how can I help my customer do more, not how can I make my application more accessible, but how can I let my customer do more, will lead you to create a vocabulary of value, an ecosystem in which you can provide leadership, and genuine differentiation in a world that would love to commoditize you tomorrow. Thank you for your time.